of the daily work of a shepherd, many times shepherds lived in a state of being unclean because they were always tending with dead animals and things like that. Many times shepherds were not very welcome in the religious realm of the kingdom because of the things that they did. So from the stance of someone going and proclaiming a message from God, he would have been considered to be about the most unlikely person. He was basically a migrant worker and an unclean person. And yet God chose him to go and pronounce this doom on the northern kingdom. Now, let's look at some of the conditions within the northern kingdom, and I kind of threw a lot of this out at you last week, kind of rapid fire, but I want to talk about it a little bit more. First, physically. What was the northern kingdom like physically? At that time period, what would have been so absurd about the message that Amos was bringing was the fact that first, they were at relative peace with the southern kingdom. Now, the northern kingdom and southern kingdom tended not to get along too well. A lot of it was because the fighting over the territory, the fighting over the kingships, one kingdom regarding the other kingdom as not being legitimate, because of the splitting of the kingdoms. All these things tended to set up a lot of disagreement between the northern and southern kingdom. At this point in the history of Israel, however, there was a relative peace that had settled over the northern and the southern kingdom, and much of that had to do with the fact of the relative peace that had settled over the territory, the world at that time. At that time, the powers outside the kingdom of Israel had allowed for peace within the kingdom of Israel. At that point, you have the Babylonians that had lost much of their former power. You had Egypt that was at an ebb, was at a low point in their power history. In fact, part of the prophecy of Amos was that these people were going to flee to Egypt or pursue Egypt as their rescue. And God was saying, I'm basically going to laugh at you because you're going to go to Egypt. You're going to try to get Egypt to be your ally. And not only are you going to go into captivity and be destroyed, but Egypt is going to be destroyed as well. And you're going to be seeking for rescue from them instead of rescue from who you need to be seeking from, who would be what? God. And isn't it strange that after the history of Israel that they would go back to Egypt to try to seek safety? How many times had that one failed on them? You remember what all happened in the desert wandering? What did they keep wanting to do? Go back to Egypt. Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. We had leeks and onions and all that kind of stuff when we were in Egypt. They were always wanting to go back to Egypt. Never did it get into their minds and hearts that Egypt actually represented that which God said was not good for them. Yeah. It goes. Yeah. It's just, that is a wonderful study in the Bible, just to go back and look at that parallel of seeking out after Egypt. And what you begin to see later on, guys, that is just as depressing, is after the Babylonian time, what do? They go start wanting to go back to seek back into the kingdom of Babylon. Israel never learned that this world was not good for them. Now, not to get off on too far of a tangent, but do you think there's a spiritual lesson there for the people of God? You get into the New Testament, God makes it pretty clear. He compares the people of God to the idea of seeking back into the things of the world. seeking back for the kingdom of Babylon, seeking back for the kingdom of Egypt. Those things are there for our good, for us to understand that God is our protector. He is the one who cares for us, not something in this world. But anyway, I don't want to get too far afield right now. But Babylon had lost much of its former power. Egypt was waning in its power, and Assyria had not yet ascended to the power that it was going to have. In fact, it's going to be the armies, that's going to be the flood that comes in on these people in a few years. But at this point, it was not yet the superpower that it was going to be. So, for all practical purposes, the world was in somewhat of a time of peace. Now, it was not a true peace. It was unsettled. It was just the fact that there were not any major conflicts going on at that point. Because of that, what else do we find? We find that Israel had grown very prosperous. And especially the northern kingdom had grown very prosperous. Now, the lack of conflict had allowed for increased trade with the other countries, with the other kingdoms of the area. And because of their ability to use slave labor within Israel, the lower class, the upper class were able to make great profits on their goods and their resources. Now, this is one of the things that God is going to condemn them for, is the fact that they treated the poor and the lower class so poorly. But, just looking at things from a physical viewpoint, the northern kingdom and Israel as a whole was doing very, very well. This would have meant that when Amos comes in, and this can be said for many of the prophets, by the way, when Amos then begins to come in preaching doom and destruction, what's going to be the typical attitude of most of the people? You got to be joking. Where is this fool coming from? We're at peace with the nations around us. We're doing good. We're more prosperous than we've ever been. And you're going to come in here and tell us God's fixing to destroy us. Get real. And that's exactly their attitude when Amos begins to preach and teach. Guys, if there's a spiritual lesson we could learn here, is that many times when we think we are at our most prosperous, we're probably at our most dangerous point. Because it's generally with prosperity that man tries to throw off the idea of God. He thinks he can do it on his own. And if you remember, that's the original sin, is man thinking, I don't need God. And so we need to again realize the importance of this lesson, that when we become the most prosperous, that's generally when we're in one of the most dangerous situations, because we tend to forget about God and think that we can do things just fine all our own. Now, I want to look at it now then. Because of that, I want us to ask ourselves the question, what was the kingdom like spiritually? And I want us to do this from within the book of Amos itself. I want to let Amos tell us what the problem was, or more specifically, let God tell us what the situation was in Israel. First, it was very religious. Now, if you don't begin to start seeing some parallels here, guys, I'm sorry. You need to wake up if you don't see some of these parallels. It was very religious. Look with me in Amos chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. Come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and multiply transgressions. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is